Welcome to our final slideshow presentation for the week. I've imaginatively named this section Democracy 2. This time we're focusing on ancient Greece. We'll go ahead and give it to the Greeks. They did invent democracy, at least the word and the specific institution. We'll hand it to them for that. Let's take a look at how that developed. Okay, so when we talk about democracy in ancient Greece, what we're really talking about is democracy in ancient Athens specifically. As we saw, Sparta did not have a democracy. A lot of the other city-states did not have democracies. They did have participatory governments. Sparta, you have 2 kings, but you also have a council of elders. You've got the ephors, you've got an assembly. So it's a monarchy, but with added opportunities for participation for the citizens. Athens as well begins as a monarchy, and it transitions to an oligarchy. So it goes from the rule by one person to the rule by a handful, a select few. We see in the 6th century BCE that Athens is having a problem. Their backbone of their military, remember we talked about that hoplite phalanx formation, the backbone of their military are small independent farmers. And they're having a rough go of it. The economy isn't doing so well, and so they're having to take out loans from their aristocratic neighbors. Well, what happens when they can't pay those loans back? Not only do they lose their farms, but they and their families are sold into slavery. This was part of the deal. The problem with that is if you are in the Athenian military, you can't be a slave and still be a citizen. So becoming a slave, you lose your citizenship, you lose your right to serve in the military, but that also means that that hoplite phalanx formation is not going to work very well because it's going to have some holes in it. And Athens starts to lose military battles, and that makes the Athenians very nervous. So the aristocracy selects one of their own, an aristocrat by the name of Solon, to institute some reforms. And he does some reforms. He addresses the symptoms, not the root cause, not the problems. So, for example, he says no new loans can be taken out that use human beings as collateral. So if you take out a loan, you could lose your farm, but you won't become a slave. All those who had been enslaved because they could not pay back their loans are now free. Do they get their land back? Ooh, no. Land redistribution is a hot button topic in this time period, and really in all time periods. When you start talking about wealth redistribution, people start getting very, very nervous. And so we saw that with Solon, he's going to take care of some things, but he's not going to go all the way. The problem with this is, okay, fine, you were enslaved because you couldn't pay back your debt. You're now free. Well, congratulations, but what are you supposed to do? You no longer have your farm. You no longer have land. So what we see happening, you have all of these people, these landless people, streaming into the urban centers, in this case, Athens. So what you have are people who are militarily trained, poor, like really poor, and pissed off. That is a perfect recipe for severe societal and political destabilization. So Solon fixed some things, but in other ways made things even worse. Enter Pisistratus, a tyrant. Now, let me talk about the word tyrant. The original meaning of the word tyrant was not in the way that we have it today, with all of the negative connotations. Excuse It was simply a person who had taken control of the government through military means. So some of these tyrants were actually quite beneficial rulers, and Pisistratus was one of them. He engaged in a huge number of public works projects. So all of these people who are in Athens who are, they're looking for something to do, he puts them to work. So they start building buildings and roads and infrastructure and things like that. And so that really helps sort of alleviate some of that pressure building up in Athens. Unfortunately, his sons were not quite the talented rulers that he was, and his sons actually are the reasons that we do have this negative connotation with tyrants, because they didn't have an understanding of the importance of his policies, and frankly, they were just so attached to their own elite status and the benefits of that they were really pretty bad rulers. All right, so the Athenians rise up, they overthrow Pisistratus's sons, and they institute, again, one of their own, Cleisthenes, to bring in some reforms. And honestly, they thought that Cleisthenes was going to, set up a return to oligarchy, but this is not what happened. Instead, Cleisthenes lays the foundation for Athenian democracy. He breaks Athenians up into 10 separate tribes. I know what you're thinking. You don't tend to think of Greeks and tribes, but the tribe is the basic organization of societies all the way up into the modern period. And really, what is a tribe but an extended kin group? So this can be actual blood kinship or marriage kinship, or it can simply be perceived kinship. But what he does is he takes the population of Athens, both the population in the city itself and in that hinterland, and he just sort of reshuffles everything so that those families that have been building up privilege and wealth are no longer connected to the communities that they have been accustomed to using as the basis for that privilege and wealth. Okay, so everybody's in 10 different tribes now. Each tribe chooses 50 of its members by lot every year to serve on the Council of 500. Okay, so it's one and done. You don't serve on the Council of 500 more than once. The council determines what the assembly will talk about, but things that happen in the government have to be passed by the assembly. And the assembly is really just all adult male citizens. And we're going to get into women here in a little bit, but for right now, just the Athenian government is made up of adult male citizens. Cleisthenes is also the one who gives us payment for government service, including jury duty. So the poor previously were not able to participate in the government as much as they might have liked because, let's face it, they got to work. And so Cleisthenes makes these payable positions, so that's not bad. He's expanding the ability of Athenians to participate in their government. So now we're going to fast forward to the classical period, to the era of Pericles. Now Pericles is an aristocrat. He lives during the 5th century BCE. He is a member of the Board of 10 Generals. Now, the Board of 10 Generals, these are all members of the aristocracy. They serve for 1-year terms. They are elected, but they can be re-elected as many times as possible. So it's the Board of 10 Generals that are actually going to be the ones to direct legislation before the assembly. And we see the quote from Thucydides in Colon Ortega about Pericles. Thucydides describes Pericles as sort of the first citizen, that democracy in Athens under Pericles became the government of the first citizen. So Pericles was so widely popular that really he could just pretty much do whatever he wanted. Under Pericles, we see an expansion and contraction of citizenship. So before Pericles, as long as one of your parents, so first of all, to be an Athenian citizen, you had to be male. But as long as one of your parents was Athenian, the other could be from Corinth or Sparta or Thebes or one of the other city-states, and you could still be considered an Athenian citizen. Under Pericles, we see that changing. So he says, okay, women can be citizens. They don't get any rights. They can't participate, but they are technically citizens. But then he also says, both of your parents must be Athenian citizens for you to be considered an Athenian citizen rather. So he expands citizenship to women, but contracts it in such a way so that both of your parents must be Athenian in order for you to be considered an Athenian. And so this is kind of interesting because what we see happening is then there's no path to citizenship. If you're not born an Athenian citizen, there is literally no way for you to become an Athenian citizen, although there will be one famous exception to that. We'll get to that a little bit later. All right, so Pericles is the one who gives us that funeral oration that we talked about in connection to war, but this is also important in our discussion of democracy, where Pericles is touting the Athenian political system as a model for the world. And this is really interesting because when we get to the Peloponnesian War, when we get to the Delian League, all of these things, when we get to Athenian expansion, democracy is only for Athenians. So if Athens expands and takes over Thebes, for example, the people of Thebes are never going to be Athenian citizens. In fact, they will be subjects of an Athenian empire. Something to think about. All right, so Pericles convinces the Athenians to go to war with Sparta. This is the beginning of that second or Great Peloponnesian War. And what we see happening is Athens and Sparta both have a plan. Sparta is going to engage in a scorched earth policy. They're going to march on the city of Athens and they're going to burn all the farmland around it. Athens has its own plan. They build a wall around Athens and on either side of the road that connects Athens to its port city of Piraeus. And that way, even though it's under siege, they can get supplies in through the port. The Spartans were much better at land warfare, whereas the Athenians were much better at naval warfare. So having an open port was very important for the Athenians. The problem is, you pull all the people of Athens behind these walls, and you're going to have a problem because of hygiene, because of germs, which they don't have germ theory yet. What we see happening then is a plague hits Athens, and Thucydides gives us a description of the plague, and it's bad. A lot of people in Athens are going to die of the plague. In fact, Pericles himself will die during the second year of the war of the plague. So with Pericles gone, we see some problems. His nephew Alcibiades takes over. Alcibiades is not Pericles. And so we see the war dragging on for years and years and years, huge amounts of loss of life and destruction on both sides. And eventually, Athens loses. Okay, so Athens has lost the war. And what we see happening after that is a period of about 50 years of civil war, where the different Greek city-states fight against each other until they're all taken over by Philip of Macedon, as we've already talked about in our section on war. But let's talk about Athens and Greece and women and their role in participation of government. While women in Sparta enjoyed many rights and freedoms due to the long absences of their fathers and husbands, women in Athens actually had the least amount of freedom of all the Greek city-states. So the men in Sparta are all gone fighting. So the women are the ones who are still left to run the household, and they actually do have, really for the time, an enormous amount of freedom, of responsibility, of power. Athens, not so much. Pericles once claimed that the best thing that could be said of a woman was nothing at all, that she should simply not be spoken of in public. The philosopher Aristotle said that women have defective souls. He also said that slaves have no souls. Plato said that if a man is a cowardly man, he will be reincarnated as a woman. Later, we have Galen, who was an important medical figure. He said that the source of a woman's weakness is her vagina. So what we see happening is in Athens especially, women are really only supposed to provide sons, and that's it. They don't even run the household. In fact, the upper class Athenian women were not supposed to go outside. You were supposed to be very pale, and that was a sign of your elite status. Only peasant women had tans. Quite the opposite effect of today. All right, but now let's talk about a little bit of hypocrisy. So Pericles, our good buddy, who said that both of your parents had to be Athenian citizens for you to be an Athenian citizen, had a mad love affair with a courtesan. In Greek, they were known as hetera. Basically, these are female slaves who are, how do I put this, sort of upper class hookers. Women who are required to provide sexual services to upper class men, and in the process of doing so, they are educated on music and philosophy, and they're supposed to be intelligent and beautiful and sexually skilled. Now remember, these women are slaves. So some of them may get a lot of power, as Aspasia of Miletus, who was the hetera favored by Pericles. She had plenty of power, but she was still a slave. So Pericles has a legal Athenian wife. They have a son who is legally recognized as an Athenian citizen, but that son dies. So Pericles goes before the assembly and asks them to vote that his illegitimate son with Aspasia should be allowed to be recognized as an Athenian citizen. A mark of how popular Pericles was. The assembly agrees. And so even though Pericles is limiting Athenian citizenship as a true act of a member of the elite, he makes sure that his own family doesn't have to follow the rules. So while the Greeks did provide us with the basics of democracy. It was far from perfect, and it worked as well as it could for a society of a certain size and at a certain level of complexity. As kingdoms, empires, what have you, grew, they realized that their areas were far larger, more heavily populated, and society becomes far more complex as time goes on. So we see that that form of direct democracy doesn't really serve the needs of later groups. So when we get to the Romans, which we'll talk about when we get to our chapter on empire, the Romans are going to have a republic. They will not have a direct democracy. We'll see that they struggle with that as well.